personally belong to a family who migrated as a refugee from Pakistani Punjab.
So the diaspora does not give funds alone, but it also provides ideas, skills, and knowledge for developmental activities.
The internal migrant labor force in Europe that actually facilitated an industrial revolution.
The Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora has an identity of being a Tamil and being a Sri Lankan.
The links between education and mobility in the context of a very strong culture of migration.
UAE is the largest destination of Indian diaspora, followed by the United States of America.
Gulf outside Kerala has created a Gulf within Kerala itself.
Work from home is not for the migrant workers. They have to go outside and they have to work.
Thank you very much for your honor and giving me this kind of a situation to share my ideas and all that. Since the topic is something which is very interesting because it deals with the evolving diasporas. So for me, it's very interesting in the sense that we can talk history. And history is something which is dear to me when we understand these things. Way back in 1990, when I was studying displacement and rehabilitation and working in Center for Social Studies, Surat, I met Professor John's, I forgot his name, but John Wood, Professor John Wood from British Columbia University, Political Science, who was also doing on displacement. It was his suggestion that I should study Punjabi diaspora, that I started reading on it. And then because of that, I started reading and I found that there were hardly any works. There were very few works. Take example, Norman Buccignani's work, on East Indians, then what we call it, that was Continuous Journey, then Voyage of Kamagata Maru comes late by some other person. Ram P. Srivastava and George Matthew had done a work on Indians abroad. And then there was one particular that Professor S.L. Sharma, who spent some time in Caribbean, came out with the idea of editing the Sociological Bulletin, a special issue on Indian diaspora. And so then Sociological Bulletin special issue came sometimes in 88 or 89. I don't remember the exact date, but that was the time. So this was the little material. But since I was focusing on the Canada, Punjabis in Canada, so finally I applied for Shastri Fellowship and went to Canada and collected data and started writing. The diaspora studies, at that time there was also some kind of a debate on whether we call it diaspora or not. But by 1992-93, this idea that what should we say is Indian overseas or Indians abroad or diaspora, all these things were going on in early 1990s. But finally, it was settled that we can use diasporas. And that was the time when, in India, the interest in the study of diasporas, Indian diasporas, started rising. I remember Professor Chandrasekhar Bhatt was one at Hyderabad University who initiated the whole process. So what happened is that it does not mean that the work on Indian migration to foreign countries was absent. For example, Tinker's study of indentured labor migration from India, Banyan Tree. There were 2 books he had written, and so there were evidences. So what we find is that there was one aspect in which the focus was on that how indentured labor migration took place towards the end of second half of 19th century to the sugarcane plantations and later on what we call a rubber plantation in Malaysia, and from different sources. But major source, of course, was what we call it Chota Nagpur Plateau, where most of the migrations occurred. These people were from Bihar, what we call it, or now Jharkhand combined. In fact, Amitabh Ghosh has also written a book, Sea of Poppies, of this kind of process that our migration started. But that was very late. But overall interest among the sociologists was limited, but it started coming. But diaspora studies were also what we call it interdisciplinary. So after some time we found critical scientists, historians, cultural studies, and all these people, they started doing it. In fact, the field of literature was more involved, in which Indian Canadian literature, Indian American literature, and all these things were happening little early, but it did not spill over to what we call it social sciences. But then it picked up in 1990, and we came up with a lot of things. This is one thing. Now, if we look at indentured labor migrants, we find that they never came back. We hardly know whether they came back. But they got settled there, and they became part of those societies. They also came from very lower caste, lower classes, working class, and all kinds of things. So I would say that that was something which we, in certain ways, we lost by way of their connection between India, their homeland, and all these countries where they went, whether it was Fiji, or it was but Mauritius, or what we call it Caribbean islands. But what happened that the major push started in two ways historically, which led to certain very interesting things. One was that British started recruitments of the local people to the British Army. And it was towards the end of 19th century that major recruitment occurred from Punjab, and large number of Punjab soldiers were there. And then in 1990s, certain soldiers, traveled all over the world and also passed through Canada and saw that land. When they returned, they also then, thought of going to those greener pastures. So they started migrating to Canada. And this was towards the beginning of the 20th century, but towards the end of the 19th century, this process started. So these people, they went. And then, what we find is that, I'll talk about their development a little late, but the early 20th century, there was another set of migration, which is very important. And that was the colonization of Africa. Towards the end of the 19th century, a development of railroads and all kinds of things in East Africa by England. And it is here that the skilled labor from Punjab and then from Gujarat, some other people, they started moving to Africa. And they stayed back. There were businessmen also, there was this thing. So in one way or the other, what we find is that by the first 2 decades of 20th century, there were 2 major communities which started migrating in terms of ethnicity, that is Punjabis and Gujaratis. In Gujarat also there were Hindus, Muslims. In Punjab there were Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims, and they all migrated. But since army recruitment policy was such in which the number of Sikhs was very high, so the Sikhs got a little bit more representation among the Punjabis. But they were not the only one in terms of that. Now, Sikh tradition was something that they immediately went there, tried to establish themselves and in that particular thing. So these are the 2. The Gujarati businessmen, they got involved in trade, and the Punjabi skilled laborers who largely belong to one caste of Ramgadiyas, that is carpenters, they also, after the railroad work was complete, they also started getting into various occupations and all that. Many of them who had gone for 5 years contract, they got a job which was, promised by the British colonial power, and they got that job and then started their own work. in along a very different lines. So by the time we get independence, we find that there were two major diasporas from India which were there. They were Punjabis and Gujaratis. By 1947, the number of Gujaratis and Punjabis might have been more or less the same, because Punjab was much bigger state than Gujarat at that time. And Gujarat was a region in the Bombay presidency. It was not a kind of a state. State comes late when reorganization of states took place. But Gujarati ethnics, they were in large numbers. They were entrepreneurs, they were business. Whereas Punjabis who went, most of them went as farm workers then, or factory workers. They started doing it. This was the first phase. But what happened to the Punjabis, particularly the Sikhs, was in terms of what we call it, right from, within 10 years or 11 years of their arrival, they got interested in Indian freedom, because the new ideas which they learned, they thought that we are colonized, we should do something for the freedom of the country. So the birth of long distance nationalism begins with these Punjabi immigrants to Canada. By the time they also, some of them went over to USA, which, Canada was still part of the colonial system, whereas USA, America, United States was a free country. And then, they got established in Happy Valley, particularly around Yuba City. So this was one. So what happened, that it was in Canada particularly and USA that they started organizing a group, and this group was interested in fighting for the freedom of the country. So they organized themselves, and then what happened, particularly in USA, because it had an effect on Canada, that but they did not have any leader, they did not have any ideas, because what should we do? And as a result of that, they thought that they needed a scholar, they needed somebody who can tell them what to do. And that was the time when a scholar whose name was Lala Hardyal, he was in Caribbean, and he was contacted and brought to San Francisco, and he was requested that he should organize all those things. So Lala Hardyal was a scholar of his own kind. His Hints for Self-Culture is one of the finest books he wrote. But at the same time, he was also not familiar with much of what is called this kind of revolt, because most of these were ex-soldiers belonging to the peasant background, and they had come here and they seriously thought about Indian freedom. So finally, he came across Prince Kropotkin's philosophy of bomb. Prince Kropotkin was follower of Mikhail Bakunin, and Mikhail Bakunin is the founder of a particular school of revolutionaries called anarchism. His basic argument, Bakunin's, was that the major source of oppression and exploitation of people is state. You destroy state, you achieve actual freedom. And Kropotkin, then there were some activities, Spain was more. Then Prince Kropotkin wrote this particular pamphlet called Philosophy of Bomb. These kinds of things were new to not new to Europe, because we have sometimes in 1850s and 1860s, the Rodniks and many of the people in Russia who also believed in similar things. But then the Ghadar Party was formed, and Ghadar Party, started thinking seriously of India's freedom. And they thought that the best way to do is to have an armed struggle, because this is what Lala Hardyal explained, that we cannot overthrow British without what we call it armed struggle. So since they were soldiers, they thought that if they can cause mutiny to the Indian army, then it would be possible to have freedom. So when the First World War begins, just before that, they decided to come back to India. And British intelligence was also keeping an eye on them in Canada. They also had their informers and all that thing. But they came to India and then they started organizing like this. Many of the important people like Singh, Sarabha. So Sardar Singh Sarabha, who did his schooling from Ravenshaw College, Cuttack, and because his family was there, then he went to Canada, USA for studies, was a young boy. And then, he also joined and returned to India for this kind of independence of country. But British suppressed it, and this came to an end. But then, most of all, when we go to the 1920s and 1930s, we have some semblance of what we call it natural labor migration under a contract system like Kangani system, which basically from Tamil Nadu to Malaysia and all that. Those kinds of things continued. But major change came after independence when India became freedom. So that was a historical situation in which after Second World War, most of the Western Europe was, devastated. It had to have reconstruction. Then Canada also planning to, develop rails from Pacific to Atlantic. And America, as true to its liberal freedom kind of tradition, announced that because of 1947, there are a large number of refugees in Punjab. Like I personally belong to a family who migrated as a refugee from Pakistani Punjab. So there were a large number of such. So then America opened that, okay, you apply for immigration, we will give you under the refugee law, which America had. So this is the time when England also wanted labor, Canada wanted labor, United States opened for refugees, and then started the second wave of migration, which was also from Punjab in a big way. And these Punjabis started leaving Punjab. Most of them belong to the peasants because that was the background. But something very interesting that except for the people who came back for freedom, the other Punjabis who were there, they got established and started their business, so many things, and they remained there. And in more than one way, they started losing contact with Punjab. Many of them never returned because they had no interest in that. Many of them, like Maya Singh, who in Canada is known as Mew Singh, he also planned some illegal migration or managed migration before independence of his relatives or of his community. He belonged to a particular community in Punjab called Mahatons. This is an upper caste, and they are overwhelmingly present in army and very educated, very prosperous, but small landowners. So he belonged to that community, and that community got its impetus from that. And this is how it happened in a big way. In fact, he had two partners when he established his lumber mill, and one of them was Kapoor Singh from Kroddi village. This is something I will again come to that. And there was another there were three of them. That was uncle of Mew Singh, that is Maya Singh. His name was Duman Singh. Later on, it became Doman Singh, and he shifted from Vancouver to Toronto to establish his industries. Now we have Doman Industries in Canada, which basically from this lumber mill thing. So that kind of thing started. So then we have the second wave of this thing. Railroad construction in Canada and other things starts little late, but it was in England that major thing happened. That large number of people started to England, and when they went there, they started, doing work. The first to give them work was in Southall in London, in a bakery kind of thing. Few of them got, and they were good workers. Some of them ex-army men who were officers in India. They knew that the Sikhs are hard working, so they gave them jobs, and slowly and steadily they established themselves and contributed. In 1950s, and early 1960s, one of the major issues, so we had a sizable, there were places from Punjab because partition had taken place. Now Muslims were out, but the Muslims who belonged to particular areas of Punjab before partition and they went to Pakistan, when Pakistani Punjab, like we came back, they, they also continued to go to Canada, England and other places. They had that particular tradition. So in England, we had Punjabi Muslims from Pakistan, a large number. We have Punjabi Hindus, a large number, and we had Punjabi Sikhs in large numbers. This is how it happened, and the thing started in a particular way. But then, India was facing a lot of problems. One of them was agricultural production, because even after independence, the problem of food was very serious. And Punjab was one place where, production was always very high because of availability of water through the traditional, what we call it, Persian wheel irrigation. Some canals which started by the British were there, so production was very high. And then Government of India decided certain policies of excise and taxation, that if some person living in England send a tractor to Punjab, no tax would be charged. And it is in this process that in a particular area of Punjab called Jalandhar-Phagwara region, which is no more a village now in a way if you come and visit that. It is here that large number of the Punjabis settled in England, they sent tractors to Punjab. This is called Massey Ferguson. It was then one company, Massey Ferguson tractors. They came in large numbers, particularly in this area. At that time, large numbers was basically 100, 100, 200 like this. But this is how this thing started. And then some well-off people had already bought tractors, but these were the people. This was not yet Green Revolution. Green Revolution comes after 1965 war. So this was the second situation in which the diaspora started, contributing to the development of the country by sending tractors because they had concern for their homeland. And this can also be seen as a kind of long distance nationalism. Because in this particular way, you find that the development of India was the most paramount thing. Because self-sufficiency in food grains was primary for government of India. And this facilitation led to a lot of factors getting imported, rather purchased in England and sent. Government also gave them some other subsidy on the import of tractors. So you witness large number of tractors, particularly those who went in early 1950s. In 1965, we know we had Indo-Pak war, and despite the fact that both India and Pakistan had ammunition which could last only for 2 weeks, but then USA threatened India, both India and Pakistan. It said that if you don't stop fighting, I will stop the supply of wheat. You know that agreement between India and USA on PL 480. Everybody knows it, that how we had this thing. But that was the time when India was emerging, and India thought that, look here, we don't want to be humiliated like this. Pakistan had a different issue. Moreover, the Pakistani Punjab was much better developed with canal irrigation, whereas the East Punjab, which went to India, was relatively less developed. But the people who had the experience of irrigation, these were the people who, knew irrigation and the value of irrigation. So it is how that Green Revolution started in Punjab, which gave tremendous prosperity to the Punjabi peasant farmer. Because 1960s was the period when the Punjab peasant and Punjab farmer had reasonably good size of land holdings. Because even in Kerala, the land reform, legislations and other things, they come very late. But the major transformation in the land holdings in Kerala, take example, came with the Kudikadappu riots, in which Hatted dwellers got the rights to own, and then the fragmentation of land took place in a big way, where most of the people, they got land, but they got 75 cents, 50 cents, and kind of a thing. And as a result of which, tremendous marginalization of land holdings took place in Kerala. But in Punjab, the lands were still good. That's why the prosperity came. But this prosperity also simultaneously led to the immigration of large number of them, because in 1960s, Canada opened and it needed two kinds of people. One was for railroad construction, they needed labor. Second was that it was expanding its education base, and particularly school education. Therefore, most of the teachers who were there in Punjab, they applied and they just went there. There was no test for them, and they were just given training in English speaking little bit, and then they were appointed as teachers. And most of them did very well. This is how Canada started opening. USA was very interesting. USA was interesting because under refugee policy, people went to Canada, America. But there was another very interesting thing, because USA also opened itself for the young students to come and study there. And if you seriously study all those people who went to USA for higher studies, you will find that most of them did not return. This also includes the mother of the present Vice President of the United States. They did study there, they never came back to India. Because USA was never interested in this, because the Anglo-Saxon world learned very early that there was a fundamental, because Gibbon was very clear when he wrote Rise and Decline and Fall of Roman Empire. One of the most important thing about Roman Empire was that it would always give citizenship to the outstanding people. And therefore, Roman Empire could flourish and sustain for a fairly long time in comparison to Greek civilization, where if you are citizen, you are citizen. If you are slave or other, you can never become citizen. The idea that citizen is born was something which was ingrained in Greek civilization, whereas Roman civilization did not have this particular idea. So as a result of which, the entire Western world, particularly the Anglo-Saxon world, had learnt it very well that any outstanding person must not, allowed to go back in indirect way, and they should serve there. So many of them got employment, and ultimately, before the fall of Soviet Union in 1991, when Russia became federation, and then ultimately different countries emerged, most of the professors of mathematics in the United States of America were Indians. They were in majority in most of the universities. But then Russians came, they were better mathematicians, and they slowly started growing in numbers. But that is very late. Now, this is how it happened. And then, then we had a oil boom in 1970s, and a new category of diaspora evolved. And this was this is something which we call transient diaspora, about which President Anthony Pallical talked about, that how in pandemic, most of the diaspora from the Gulf, they returned to different parts of India. That was a major issue, and it is going to have consequences. But then, the very orientation of diaspora also started undergoing a change. And this orientation was that that we are not going to come back to India. We would stay here in our countries. One was that this is the time in 1980s and 90s that different parts of India, from different parts of India, people started migrating, like nurses from Kerala, they started going to different parts of the world, because this kind of expert, labor force was needed. And then most of these countries also changed this kind of a thing. But this whole question of diaspora continued. For example, in 1980, Punjab got disturbed When Punjab got disturbed, in 1973, one Jagjit Singh Chauhan got it printed or published in New York Times, the map of Khalistan. Jagjit Singh Chauhan was a kind of frustrated politician who was also a Trans-Minister in government of Punjab at one time. Then he was sidelined, and then he went to England and he lived there and died after coming to India when most of the cases against him were withdrawn and he was okay. That was very late. But then there were others like Ganga Singh Dhillon and all that. They started talking about Khalistan and all that thing. And in Punjab, the movement had started obliquely. And it is here that large number of Sikh population, this fragmentation, division occurred among the Punjabis. The Hindu Punjabis and the Sikh Punjabis, they got little separated on this. And then many of them came to India to participate in the struggle for Khalistan. And many of them, they left India to escape any kind of persecution. All these things happened, but the diaspora participation was there. I remember even in 1998, when I went to a Gurdwara in Toronto, in Mississauga, the photograph of some of the separatists there. So there was a group which always talked about what is called Khalistan. This was another aspect of long distance nationalism, which started in a way in which there is a kind of secessionist. One was that you struggle for the freedom of the country. Another was that you contribute to the development of your country. And third was that no, you belong to a particular religious ethnic group and you try to remain, struggle for that. This is not new that the Sikhs were doing it. One should not forget. If I am not wrong about Fizo, but I am definitely right about Mawe and Lal Denga. Lal Denga was in England. Mawe is in England. I don't know whether he is alive now or not. I think Fizo also left India. This was the difference between is that Fizo was the originator of the movement of Nagaland's liberation. Then Mawe, who basically was from Manipur, but he belonged to the Naga tribe in the hills. He organized National Socialist Council of Nagaland, and then Mizoram National Front was something which was established by Lal Denga, who was working in the municipality of Aizawl. And then there was an in 1966 famine in Mizoram. There was an organization of Mizoram National Food Front, something like that, which then he organized Mizoram National Front, MNF, and became its leader, and he started insurgency. But these people, they also went to England, and then this whole idea of long distance nationalism was something which was not unexperienced by Indian state by way of Khalistan. It was already there, kind of thing. But Punjab was a very different kind of a picture, because Punjabis, particularly the Sikhs, were among the most integrated into Indian nation building process, because their number in army was very large. There were transporters everywhere in the country, and despite the fact this all noise was being done, majority of the Punjabis remained alienated from this kind of phenomenon. The only thing was that since the voice was very loud for Khalistan among the diaspora, but their number was far less, and it died down in 1990s. It is just some groups and all that. Its culmination point, diaspora's culmination point, was when Air India flight was bombed in 1986, and then finally some people were arrested by Canadian government and all that. Other than that, we find that this particular aspect is somewhere people talk about it, but it now exists as some people's notion. But it does not mean that Punjabi diaspora started, lost interest to habits and taste. And some of the things that returned were the alive interest in what we call it in the development of their country. And towards the end, I'll also talk about something else to conclude. The village Khadodi, which I mentioned, of Kapoor Singh, this also had most of the people in Canada, USA, and England. Some of them returned. They were doctors and all that. So they decided that this is too bad. We organize parks, religious functions, build some gates. But the best thing is to improve the life conditions of the villages. So Khadodi started with the development of the village. And in obliquely, by developing their village, they also provided a model. Notwithstanding the fact that this is the time when Kapoor Singh's daughters came back, and during near Namashahar at Aur, they also established one cancer hospital. And this kind of development started in terms of contributing to the development of education, contribute to the development of health, and then also improving the conditions of the villages to which they belonged. And it started from this particular village in Hoshiarpur district, but it spread to virtually most of Punjab, that the people would come. But there was also a very interesting thing. The interesting thing is that the moment they started doing it, they also got interested in Punjab and Indian politics. So the political participation sitting abroad was another aspect which one has to keep in mind. Now, the participation in this kind of a politics is something which is twofold. One is that your participation in electoral politics. It was done very extensively in the 21st century, in which at least there was one minister in Punjab government when before 2014, he was education minister also. He he lived in USA, had a lot of petrol pumps, but he was also equally interested in India and also participated in election and became MLA. This was one particular thing. But what happened in 2017 was phenomenal, because most of the diaspora Punjabis, they were, tired of what is called the kind of corruption which was there in India, in Punjab, they were facing. So they finally decided that they should contribute. So Aam Aadmi Party was heavily financed by the diaspora in Punjab. But it is not only Punjab where it is happening. We should not forget that during one time when Chief Minister of Gujarat, he applied for visa to visit USA, he was refused because many Indians said that he was instrumental in riots against Muslims in Gujarat. But then the Gujarati diaspora supported anti-Muslim campaign to the extent that it also participated in one way or the other. Like How to Modi is something, but we have Parita Mukta virtually, editing a particular issue of race and ethnic studies journal, in which she talks about that how the Gujarati diaspora is financing hate in India, which again means that it has something to do with what we call it the communal and other things which happen. So what we find, the Indian diaspora is very, very active in terms of different shades of what we call it long distance nationalism. But suppose they don't do anything like this. Suppose we say that okay, we have waves of people going back, and because of the development of technology, these people are, actively interacting. Virtually, there is everyday interaction between Punjab or Gujarat or other parts of India with the diaspora, and they know each and everything. We have large number of online, channels, which basically have been opened by these people. and they keep a tag on what is happening in India by way of everything. Before I come to the last thing, this is something which we should remember, that in the age of present technology, this is something which has to happen. That transnational communities which are emerging in different parts of the world, they are more concerned with their homelands in a way, because they feel now very close, because the information flow is very high. So technology has enabled the diaspora to become more or less equal participants. So 1992, when Manmohan Singh talked about foreign money, at that time it seems that as if nothing is happening. But we have one Latin American scholar, Ozoko, who talked about that how we can build a connection between, or the contribution of the diaspora with the homeland country. He talks about three, four things. One, he talks about what he calls it shopping. And when people from abroad come, they do shopping. Then they also do tourism. That is, they go from one place to another. They have to hire taxis and all that. They do tourism all over the country. Most of them go there. And then they also transfer money to their families, which are there in India. They send money and all that. Then when they come, there is also what we call it a communication. So telecommunication is another aspect. So whether they do not do anything for the development of India, to the extent that at one point of time, the Punjab worked out that 22% of the economic contribution is something which perhaps comes from the diaspora. In the month of October, large number of them come to Punjab, and then in the month of March they go back. They stay here in the winter season in the north, and during the summer season, particularly starting from March, April, and then sometimes in September, October and November, the people from Australia come, because their winter is in the sometimes what we call it this thing, but they also come during the summer season, their summer season, and which means the winter season. So you find large number of people coming and spending money looking after their properties. But the recent example of that, how this works, is the farmers movement. Now this farmers movement is something in which, again, the Indian diaspora is participating in one way or the other. We see that most of the major cities in US, Canada, England, the people with farmers background, they participated in it. This is one thing. And then many of them came to India, doctors and others, and they are stationed on the borders of what we call it Delhi. I watched one video of which, one girl from Uttar Pradesh who studied in USA, she returned and she said that she wanted to participate in this farmers movement because something is going on in this way, kind of a thing. Now, what is happening is that if we have to imagine diaspora now and its evolution, we find that over a period of time, this diaspora is going to become more and more involved in India's political life, India's economic life, because we also need foreign money for our country. This pandemic thing is something which is transitory, maybe 2-3 years, because socially, this kind of times are not much, though people suffer. And for people, the time is very long, but largely socially evaluating, this time will pass and the interest in India and other things would continue. So to my mind, this is the time when we have to find out more significance, more contribution of the diaspora than we still can anticipate. So I think this is something which I wanted to share with you by way of this inaugural address. And I thank Professor M.S. Jayakumar for requesting me and all that kind of thing. Thank you very much.